You know, we often think of places steeped in history, maybe ancient Greece or the British Isles. But get this. Today, we're plunging into the past of an island that has been shaped by a truly mind-boggling array of forces over millennia, Taiwan.
Hmm.
Forget what you think you know. Its story, stretching back way before recorded history and many other places, is absolutely packed with surprises.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you handed over a pretty comprehensive Wikipedia article on Taiwan's history. It's a journey through time on an epic scale. I mean, tens of thousands of years in the making.
Wow.
So our goal here is to, we'll cut through the sheer volume of information, bring you the most fascinating, crucial insights, give you a real handle on Taiwan's incredibly rich and varied past without getting bogged down in endless details.
Right.
We'll be uncovering everything from the earliest human traces to, colonial clashes, imperial rule, and its dramatic evolution into the modern era.
Okay, let's unpack this, and I mean really go back. Prehistoric Taiwan. The source mentions evidence of human life tens, thousands of years ago. Think about that. We're talking Ice Age conditions.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here is the geological backdrop. During that period, sea levels were dramatically lower.
Much lower.
So the Taiwan Strait, which now separates Taiwan from mainland China, was actually dry land, a land bridge.
The land bridge.
And this allowed for the initial human migrations to the island, as well as the movement of various animals.
And speaking of animals, there's a really intriguing find mention, the Penghu 1 jawbone.
Oh, yeah, that was.
Discovered in the channel between the Penghu Islands and Taiwan, it might even belong to a previously unknown human species, possibly hundreds of thousands of years old.
It's pretty wild. It makes you wonder who these very early inhabitants might have been, walking across that ancient land bridge.
Absolutely.
It certainly does fire the imagination. Then, moving forward in time, we find the oldest direct evidence of modern human presence on Taiwan fragments and a tooth unearthed in the Zhudo district,
Okay.
estimated to be between 20,000 and 30,000 years old. These are tangible connections to the earliest Homo sapiens we know of on the island.
Then we have the Changbin culture, right? Dating from around 15,000 to 5,000 years ago, known for their basic chipped pebble tools.
That's right. It gives you a glimpse into a very early Paleolithic way of life on Taiwan. Simple tools, hunter-gatherer existence, probably.
And if we connect this to a wider understanding, something about Sun Moon Lake.
Yeah, sediment analysis from Sun Moon Lake suggests the beginnings of agriculture around 11,000 years ago,
Agriculture that early.
starting with slash-and-burn techniques, apparently, and then eventually transitioning to rice cultivation. This marks a fundamental shift in how humans interacted with their environment on the island.
It's like watching the slow motion development of human civilization in one location.
Hmm.
Then, boom, around 10,000 years ago, that land bridge vanishes.
Sea levels rise, yeah. Creates the Taiwan Strait and essentially isolates the island.
Must have been a huge change.
Oh, definitely. This geographical separation likely played a pivotal role in the unique development of Taiwan's early cultures, allowing them to diverge in their own ways.
Okay.
And then, quite suddenly, around 3000 BC, we see the emergence of the Neolithic Depenking culture.
Depengheng. And it's interesting, the article says it doesn't seem to be a direct descendant of Changbin.
Right, which hints at maybe another wave of migration or perhaps significant cultural influence coming in from elsewhere. It's a bit of a puzzle.
And these Depengheng people, they're linked to today's indigenous peoples.
Believed to be the ancestors, yeah. Speaking early Austronesian languages. And here's where it gets really mind-blowing.
Go on.
The article states that Taiwan is considered the origin point for most branches of the entire Austronesian language family.
Wait, the whole family? Like Philippines, Indonesia, Madagascar?
Pretty much. Think about that linguistic spread across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, even parts of Madagascar, all potentially stemming from Taiwan. It's incredible.
That is staggering. A small island being the launch pad for all that.
What's truly remarkable is that a seemingly relatively small island like Taiwan served as the launch pad for languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people across a vast expanse of the globe. It fundamentally shifts our understanding of early human seafaring capabilities and the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate cultures.
Wow.
These early inhabitants were not only skilled agriculturalists cultivating rice and millet, but also deeply connected to the sea and its resources.
And they weren't totally isolated either, right? There's mention of trade with the Philippines.
Yeah, surprisingly early trade links, even as far back as the second millennium BC. Jade from eastern Taiwan has been found there.
Jade. That implies some pretty sophisticated exchange networks.
Absolutely. These weren't just isolated communities. And as we move into later prehistoric periods, we see the introduction of iron, possibly through trade with the Philippines again, around 400 AD.
So technology is advancing, trade is happening.
Exactly. This gradual adoption of new technologies would have further transformed their societies and ways of life.
Okay, so we've established this long and rich period of prehistoric development and indigenous cultures. When does China enter the picture in a more significant and undeniable way?
Well, the article details early Chinese references to islands in the east, and some historians propose these may have been Taiwan.
May have been, so it's not certain.
Not entirely, no. For instance, there are records of the Eastern Wu Kingdom visiting an island called Yuzu as early as 230 AD, and the Sui dynasty sent expeditions to a place called Luqui in the 7th century.
Yuzu, Luki.
But it's important to note that the connection of these early mentions specifically to Taiwan is still debated among scholars. Later, the name Luqui would actually come to refer to the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa and such.
Ah, okay. So, intriguing hints, but not definitive proof of sustained contact just yet. What about the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan? Was the contact more concrete then?
A bit clearer, yeah, though somewhat accidental at first. In 1292, Kublai Khan dispatched officials to demand allegiance from the Ryukyu kingdom,
Right, Lukwei again.
but they mistakenly landed on Taiwan. After a brief and hostile encounter, they were forced to retreat. Another expedition followed in 1297.
So they definitely knew something was there.
And interestingly, by 1349, there's a record from a guy named Wang Daiwan mentioning pottery originating from mainland China being found in Taiwan.
Pottery suggests trade, right?
Strongly suggests that Chinese merchants had likely visited the island by that time, engaging in trade.
Okay, so by the 14th century, we're seeing at least some level of interaction, probably trade. What happens in the centuries leading up to more significant Han-Chinese settlement?
Things definitely pick up pace. By the early 16th century, the interactions become more frequent and have greater consequences. Growing numbers of Han Chinese fishermen, traders, and even individuals involved in piracy began to frequent the southwestern coasts of Taiwan.
Fishermen, traders, pirates, a mixed bunch.
Definitely. And some merchants from the Fujian province even developed a working knowledge of the local indigenous languages.
That indicates pretty regular contact then.
Sustained contact and exchange, yeah.
It sounds like Taiwan was gradually becoming a more familiar location on maritime routes. The article mentions names like Xiaodongdao and Dahoiguo.
Exactly. Dahuiguo, it's believed, was derived from Taiwan,
Taiyuan.
the name of a prominent local Aboriginal tribe near what is now the city of Tainan. Over time, this name became associated with the wider island, eventually evolving into the name we know today, Taiwan.
Ah, so that's where Taiwan comes from. Interesting.
Yep. And by the late 16th century, we see the beginnings of established Chinese settlements in the southwestern parts of the island, primarily by people from Fujian.
Settlements. So more permanent presence now.
And by 1593, the Ming authorities were even issuing official licenses for trade in the north,
Official licenses, so the government is acknowledging it.
effectively acknowledging and regulating the already existing, though previously often unofficial, trade activities.
What kind of goods were being exchanged in this early trade? What were people after?
Initially in the north, the Chinese traders exchanged things like iron tools and textiles for valuable local resources, coal, sulfur, gold, and especially venison from the indigenous communities.
Venison, okay. Deer.
And the Southwest became particularly important for the seasonal mullet fishing. But yeah, the trade in deer products really flourished.
Why deer specifically?
Taiwanese deer hides were highly sought after by the Japanese, and Chinese merchants used this trade to cleverly circumvent Ming Dynasty bans on direct trade with Japan.
Ah, a workaround.
Exactly. They'd acquire the hides from Taiwan and then sell them to the Japanese for substantial profits.
That's a pretty ingenious way to bypass trade restrictions. The article also highlights Chen Di's expedition in 1603. What was the significance of that?
Oh, this expedition is crucial for our understanding. Chan Di was part of a Ming military expedition sent to deal with pirates operating in the region.
Right, pirates again.
But during his time there, he meticulously documented his observations of Taiwan in a written account called Dongfanji.
Dongfanji. What did it say?
It's invaluable because it not only provides detailed descriptions of the indigenous people, their customs, their way of life,
Yeah.
but it also explicitly notes the presence of a considerable number of Chinese settlers already living alongside them.
Already there in 1603. Wow.
And we also have corroborating evidence from a Portuguese shipwreck in 1596. Survivors reported seeing cultivated land.
Cultivated land, likely those Chinese settlers farming.
Most likely, yeah, the work of these early Chinese agriculturalists.
So by the time the Dutch arrived in 1623, Taiwan was far from an uninhabited island waiting to be discovered. There was already a significant Chinese presence.
Precisely. When the Dutch showed up, they encountered an estimated 1,500 Chinese visitors and residents. Some had even introduced Chinese agricultural crops to the island.
1,500, that's not insignificant.
Not at all. Established Chinese communities existed, and remarkably, there was even evidence of a Chinese-speaking population living within an Aboriginal village, speaking a kind of Creole language, blending Chinese and indigenous tongues.
A Creole language that really shows deep interaction.
Absolutely. It clearly demonstrates a significant level of interaction and even cohabitation well before European colonization began.
Which brings us neatly to the period of Dutch and Spanish colonial presence. Formosa, the beautiful island. That name, as the article reminds us, was given by Portuguese explorers way back in 1542.
Yes, Ilha Formosa. Beautiful island. But it was the Dutch who mounted a more sustained and impactful effort at colonization.
Right. They didn't start in Taiwan itself, did they?
No, they initially tried Penghu, the Pescadores Islands. But the Ming forces drove them out in 1624, so they strategically established Fort Zeelandia.
The famous one.
Yeah, and later Fort Provincia in the southwestern part of Taiwan, near modern Tainan.
And they weren't the only European power sniffing around. The Spanish also made a relatively brief appearance in the north of the island.
That's correct. They saw the growing Dutch presence in the south as a potential threat to their own colonial holdings in the Philippines.
Ah, strategic positioning.
Exactly. So the Spanish established their own settlements in Keelung and Tamsui, starting in 1626.
But it didn't last long for them.
No, their northern colony faced numerous challenges: disease, hostile local indigenous groups, and frankly, a lack of consistent support and resources from Manila. Ultimately, the Dutch forces were able to oust them completely in 1642.
So the Dutch consolidated European control.
Pretty much, yeah. They became the dominant European power on the island for a time.
It sounds like the 17th century was a period of intense geopolitical competition playing out even on this relatively small island. The article also mentions the role of Chinese pirates during this time, figures like Li Dan and the more famous Zheng Zilong, saying his father, right?
The very same. These pirates were indeed influential players in the regional dynamics. Lai Dan even acted as a mediator sometimes between the Ming authorities and the newly arrived Dutch.
A pirate mediator. Interesting time.
Very. It became a common practice for pirate groups operating in the Taiwan Strait to offer protection guarantees to trading vessels in exchange for fees, basically a protection racket.
And the Dutch got involved in that too?
Oh yeah, the Dutch themselves became involved in this system. Zheng Zilong eventually rose to become the dominant pirate leader in the area, even collaborating with the Dutch at certain points.
But didn't he eventually work for the Ming?
He did. Through a complex series of conflicts and realignments, he was eventually appeased by the Chinese imperial government and even tasked with clearing the coast of other pirate activity. His life story really highlights the fluid and often opportunistic power dynamics of the era.
Fascinating character. There's also a note about early Japanese trade interests in Taiwan and even some unsuccessful attempts at conquest before the Dutch arrived.
Yes, the Japanese had been actively involved in trading with Taiwan even before the Dutch established their colony. In 1609, the Tokugawa shogunate sent an exploratory mission to check the island out.
See what was there.
And a more ambitious attempt at military conquest in 1616, however, was thwarted by a severe typhoon. Lucky break for Taiwan, maybe.
Maybe. And how did the Dutch handle Japanese trade once they were established?
Well, the Dutch moved to restrict Japanese trade activities in the region, which actually hurt their own profits initially.
Oh, unintended consequence.
But after 1635, the Japanese shogunate basically forbade Japanese citizens from traveling abroad, the Sakoku policy. So the Dutch effectively eliminated Japanese commercial competition in Taiwan after that.
Okay, so the Dutch solidified their control in the Southwest. What did their colonization efforts look like in practice? How did they govern?
Well, the Dutch strategy involved forging alliances with certain Aboriginal villages like Sengkan, while simultaneously engaging in conflict with others, most notably Matau and Solong.
Divide and conquer, essentially.
To some extent. And their campaigns to pacify resistant groups could be exceptionally brutal. There are documented instances of massacres, like those that occurred on Luki Island, the smaller one near Taiwan, not the Ryukis.
Grim stuff. What about administration?
They established a system of colonial administration, implemented a formal tax system, and even introduced schools,
Schools. Teaching what?
teaching a Romanized script of the local indigenous languages alongside the principles of Christianity. This marked the first significant and sustained introduction of Christianity to Taiwan.
Romanized script. That's interesting. Trying to make administration easier, presumably.
Probably, yeah. And maybe spread their influence?
It sounds like they were actively trying to reshape the island and its inhabitants according to their own vision. But it wasn't a peaceful process, was it? The article mentions unpopular taxes and insurrections.
Absolutely not peaceful. The poll tax, which was levied on basically every non-Dutch person over the age of 6, proved to be particularly unpopular.
Everyone over 6. Harsh.
Very. And it directly led to significant uprisings in 1640 and again in 1652. There were also taxes imposed on hunting, which obviously impacted indigenous communities.
So resistance was ongoing.
Definitely. While the Dutch exerted their direct administrative control primarily over the Western Plains region, their systems of governance and taxation did leave a lasting influence that subsequent rulers would build upon.
What about the Chinese population living under Dutch rule? It sounds like their numbers were quite significant by this point.
Oh yeah. The Dutch actively incentivized and encouraged Han Chinese migration to Taiwan.
They wanted more Chinese settlers. Why?
Labor. They explicitly advertised the economic opportunities available, even sometimes providing financial assistance for relocation. They needed workers for the expanding rice and sugar plantations.
Cheap labor for cash crops.
Essentially, yes. This led to the arrival of thousands of people, predominantly young, single men.
Mostly men.
Mostly men, yeah. Which led to a substantial demographic shift on the island. Although it's important to note, the Chinese population under Dutch rule had limited rights to own land.
I see. And how did the Dutch manage relations between the Chinese settlers and the indigenous groups?
They tried to regulate interactions, and they tried to maintain control over key trade goods, especially those deer hides, which remained a valuable commodity.
But were there conflicts? The article mentions Fauverlang.
Yes, as the Chinese population grew and their settlements expanded geographically, tensions and outright conflicts over access to land and natural resources inevitably arose with the indigenous communities. The Dutch colonial administration attempted to mediate these disputes and maintain control, but it proved to be a persistent and complex challenge.
Sounds messy. The increasing financial demands from Batavia, the Dutch East India Company's headquarters, also seem to have been a major source of friction.
Precisely. Batavia constantly pressured the colonial administration in Taiwan to generate more revenue, more profit.
The bottom line.
Always. This led to the implementation of increasingly burdensome taxes on the Chinese settlers, which in turn fueled widespread discontent. The Guohuai Rebellion in 1652 was a direct and major consequence of this financial pressure.
What triggered that one specifically?
A residency tax. While the rebellion was ultimately brutally suppressed, it had a significant negative impact on the available labor force and really demonstrated the underlying tensions within the colony.
And ultimately, Dutch rule came crashing down with the dramatic invasion led by Koxinga in 1661.
Zhang Qinggong, yeah. Known in the West as Koxinga. He was a staunch Ming Dynasty loyalist who sought to establish a base of operations in Taiwan.
Why Taiwan?
To continue resistance against the newly established Qing Dynasty on the Chinese mainland. He viewed Taiwan as strategically vital for this purpose.
So it wasn't just about kicking out the Dutch.
No, it was part of a bigger plan. In 1661, his naval forces launched a large-scale invasion, and following a 9-month siege of Fort Zeelandia, the Dutch finally surrendered in 1662. They completely withdrew from Taiwan by 1668, marking the end of their colonial endeavor.
So begins the Kingdom of Tungning, founded by Koxinga and later ruled by his descendants. He immediately renamed the former Dutch forts, right?
Yep. He renamed Fort Zeelandia to Amping and Fort Provincia to Chikan, and he established what he declared to be the Ming Eastern Capital.
Ming Eastern Capital, showing his loyalty.
Exactly. Though it was later officially renamed Dongwin by his son Zhang Jing. They quickly set about establishing a rudimentary administrative structure for the new kingdom, dividing the territory into prefectures and counties, largely based on existing Chinese models.
Koxinga himself, though a pivotal figure, didn't rule for very long after establishing his base in Taiwan. He died in 1662.
Right, quite soon after the victory.
Yet, as the article points out, he has become a really significant and enduring figure in Chinese nationalism.
Yes, he is widely remembered and revered, particularly for his success in expelling the Dutch colonial power from Taiwan and for his unwavering loyalty to the fallen Ming dynasty. After his death, though, there was a period of internal power struggles.
Ah, succession disputes.
Pretty much, his son Jing eventually emerged as the dominant ruler.
Now, the Qing dynasty, which had by this point firmly established itself on the mainland after overthrowing the Ming, was surely not going to just let this independent Ming loyalist kingdom exist right off their coast, were they?
Absolutely not. The Qing government viewed the Kingdom of Tunning as a direct threat. They enacted a strict sea ban along the southeastern coast of China,
Trying to starve them out.
trying to weaken the Zheng forces by cutting off their vital supplies and trade. They even, somewhat ironically, collaborated with their former Dutch enemies in several naval battles against the Zheng fleet.
The king and the Dutch teamed up. Strange bedfellows.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. Though initial attempts by joint Qing-Dutch forces to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan were repeatedly thwarted by bad weather. Typhoons, mostly.
Lucky again. Did the king try diplomacy?
They did. They attempted negotiations, offering a degree of autonomy to the Zheng regime in exchange for acknowledging Qing suzerainty and adopting Manchu customs, like the hairstyle.
The Q hairstyle.
That's the one. But Jing ultimately refused these terms, determined to maintain his independence and Ming traditions.
Zheng Jing even became embroiled in the large-scale revolt of the three feudatories on the mainland. That shows the interconnectedness of the conflicts at the time.
He did indeed. He saw an opportunity to potentially expand his influence and challenge Qing power. His forces even managed to recapture the important port city of Xiamen for a period.
But it didn't work out in the end.
No. Ultimately, his efforts on the mainland were unsuccessful, and his forces were eventually pushed back and defeated by the Qing armies.
So he retreated back to Taiwan.
Yeah. Despite these setbacks on the mainland, he continued to maintain and develop the Ming-style governmental structures in Taiwan, though real power tended to reside with the leading military figures within his regime.
And how did Taiwan fare under his rule?
His rule actually saw significant agricultural and infrastructural development within Taiwan. They became largely self-sufficient in grain production.
That's crucial, especially with the Qing sea ban.
Absolutely. He also actively promoted Chinese culture and learning, funding the construction of temples and establishing an imperial academy and a Confucian shrine in Tainan, trying to solidify that Ming identity.
What was Zheng Jing's approach and policies towards the various Aboriginal tribes living on Taiwan? Still a significant part of the population, presumably.
Definitely. Zheng Jing's policies largely aimed at a form of Sinicization, attempting to integrate the indigenous population into the dominant Han Chinese cultural and administrative framework.
How did they do that?
He sent teachers to Aboriginal villages to provide assistance with farming techniques and to teach the Chinese language. But there are reports of punishments being implemented for those who refuse to learn.
Forced assimilation, essentially.
It leaned that way. And meanwhile, the continued expansion of Han Chinese settlements inevitably led to further encroachment on traditional Aboriginal territories, which resulted in a number of localized rebellions during his rule.
So still conflict there.
Oh, yes. Despite these tensions and conflicts, the Han Chinese population in Taiwan more than doubled during the period of the Kingdom of Tunning.
Wow, doubled. That's fast growth.
Significant growth, fueled by migration and settlement.
Economically, how did the Kingdom of Tunning fare as an independent entity? Could it sustain itself?
Actually, it prospered significantly. It became a major trading hub in the region, effectively linking the markets of Japan and Southeast Asia.
What were they trading? Still deer hides?
Deerskin, yes, still big. And sugarcane, both were in high demand in Japan. They held near monopolies on these highly valued goods. Their economy became more diversified than it had been under the Dutch.
More diversified than the Dutch. Interesting.
Yeah, by the end of the Zheng dynasty's rule, the government was reportedly generating a greater annual income than the Dutch had at the peak of their power in Taiwan.
So, quite successful economically, despite the pressures. But it didn't last. The eventual downfall of the Kingdom of Tunning is closely linked to the figure of Xi Lang.
Xi Lang.
He was originally a prominent military leader under the Zheng regime, who later famously defected to the king, wasn't he?
He was. And Xi Lang plays an absolutely crucial role in the king's eventual conquest of Taiwan. After his defection, he became a strong advocate within the king court for the necessity of invading and annexing Taiwan.
Why was he so keen?
He emphasized its critical strategic importance for the security of the mainland, basically argued, if we don't take it, someone else might.
Makes sense.
Following the death of Zheng Jing, there was a period of political turmoil and instability within the Kingdom of Tunning. Power struggles again.
Oh, is the succession issues?
Seems so. Xilang was placed in command of the Qing naval forces, and his decisive victory against the Zheng fleet in the pivotal Battle of Penghu in 1683
Back to Penghu.
effectively cleared the way for the Qing invasion of Taiwan itself. Facing overwhelming odds and internal divisions, Sheng Jing's successor, his grandson Zheng Kexuang, eventually surrendered to the Qing forces.
And that was the end.
That was the end of the Kingdom of Tunning, led to the formal annexation of Taiwan by the Qing Empire.
So in 1683, Taiwan officially becomes a part of the Qing dynasty. Interestingly, the article mentions that there was initially a significant debate within the Qing government about whether they should even keep Taiwan at all.
Yes, that's fascinating, isn't it? There was a strong faction within the Qing court that argued for abandoning Taiwan altogether.
Why abandon it after conquering it?
They cited the logistical difficulties of defending it, the potential financial burden of its administration. Basically, is it worth the hassle?
But Xilang disagreed.
Vehemently. He persuasively argued in favor of its strategic importance, emphasizing the need to prevent any other foreign power, maybe Europeans, maybe remnants of rebels, from potentially using it as a base to threaten the mainland.
And his arguments won.
Ultimately, yes. His arguments prevailed, and in 1684 the king established Taiwan Prefecture as an administrative division under the jurisdiction of Fujian Province.
Part of Fujian. Okay. The king initially implemented restrictions on migration from the mainland to Taiwan. Why did they do that after arguing it was important?
Well, the initial king policy was to limit the population increase in Taiwan, probably due to concerns about the challenges of governing a potentially restive new territory and managing limited resources. They even forcibly relocated a significant number of people back to the mainland shortly after the contact.
Really? Kicked people out.
Some, yeah. But this policy soon led to severe labor shortages in Taiwan.
Oops. Backfired.
Pretty much. It prompted local Qing officials to unofficially encourage and even facilitate further migration, sometimes even using government warships to transport civilian settlers.
Unofficially encouraging it while officially restricting it. Classic bureaucracy.
You could say that. Despite the official prohibitions, illegal migration continued on a large scale, reaching tens of thousands of people annually by the early 18th century.
Tens of thousands a year, illegally. Wow. These restrictions on migration must have led to some rather unique social situations in early Qing Taiwan. The article mentions the poignant saying, "Has Tangshan father, no Tangshan mother." What does that tell us?
That idiom, yeah, it poignantly illustrates the overwhelmingly skewed gender ratio among the early Han Chinese migrants to Taiwan.
Why were there so few women?
Because of the official ban on bringing families. Kangshan was a common term referring to mainland China. So these predominantly male migrants often formed relationships and married locally.
Married local women, including indigenous women.
Yes, including with women from Aboriginal communities, although this practice was later officially prohibited by the Qing authorities.
Why prohibit that?
Partly due to concerns over potential land disputes and the complexities of administering populations with different customs. It got complicated.
I bet. Did they ever relax the rules on families migrating?
Over the course of the 18th century, the Qing government's regulations regarding family migration fluctuated. But by 1875, all restrictions on entering Taiwan were finally repealed.
Why then?
Largely because they had proven to be practically unenforceable in the face of persistent migration pressures. People just kept coming.
Makes sense. What about the Qing administration of Taiwan itself? Did they immediately exert firm control over the entire island, or was their reach more limited initially?
Initially, Qing administrative control was largely concentrated on the western plains of Taiwan, where the majority of the Han Chinese settlements were located.
Just the West.
Mostly. They maintained a relatively minimal administrative presence and, for a considerable period, restricted territorial expansion into the eastern and mountainous regions of the island until 1796.
Why avoid the east and the mountains?
Primarily due to concerns about potential instability and conflicts with the various indigenous groups inhabiting those areas. It was seen as difficult and maybe not worth the trouble initially.
But eventually they did expand control.
Driven by the continued influx of Han Chinese settlers, Qing influence gradually extended over the entire Western Plains region by the reign of the young Zheng Emperor. Figures like Lan Dingyuan, who played a key role in suppressing the Zhu Yigi rebellion.
We'll get to rebellions later, I assume.
We will. He later advocated for further land reclamation and expansion as a way to better manage the growing Chinese settler population.
The king also developed a specific system for classifying the Aboriginal population, dividing them into Shufan and Shengfan. What was the distinction there?
Right. The Qing authorities categorized the indigenous population into Shufan, which literally translates to something like accustomed or civilized Aborigines,
Civilized meaning.
meaning groups who had, to varying degrees, adopted Han Chinese customs, paid taxes, and were considered more integrated into the Qing administrative system.
Okay, and the other group.
The Shengfan, meaning wild or uncooked Aborigines. This referred to those groups who largely maintained their traditional ways of life and remained outside of direct Qing administrative control, typically in the mountains.
So basically, assimilated versus unassimilated from the king perspective.
That's a good way to put it. The king made only limited and often unsuccessful efforts to directly administer the Shengfan territories, while boundaries were formally established to separate Han Chinese settlements from Aboriginal lands.
Did the boundaries work?
Not really. The reality was that settler encroachment continued despite these official measures.
And the Han Chinese population kept growing.
Dramatically. It increased from around 120,000 in 1683 to well over 2 million by the late 19th century. That put increasing pressure on indigenous lands and resources.
2 million. That's huge growth. Over time, the king's attitude and policies towards Aboriginal territories seem to have shifted, particularly as we move into the 19th century.
Exactly. While initially cautious about expansion, by the early 19th century, local king officials increasingly advocated for the colonization and development of Aboriginal-held territories, particularly in strategically important areas like Gamelon, modern-day Yilan, on the northeast coast.
What caused that shift? Just population pressure.
Population pressure was part of it, but this shift in policy was often triggered by external crises. A big one was the Japanese invasion of southern Taiwan in 1874, the Mudan incident.
The Medan incident. We'll need to unpack that one, too.
We will. But that event really exposed the king's limited effective control over parts of the island. It spurred recommendations from officials like Shen Baozhen to exert greater authority over the Aboriginal regions to prevent further foreign incursions.
Ah, so it became a security issue. Control it, or someone else will.
Precisely the logic.
This ultimately led to renewed and more forceful colonization efforts in the late Qing period, under influential figures like Shen Baozhen and Lu Mingchuan. Taiwan even achieved the status of its own separate province in 1887.
That's right. Shen Baozhen, recognizing the strategic vulnerabilities highlighted by the Mudan incident, actively lifted the remaining bans on entering Taiwan and strongly promoted further Han Chinese settlement, particularly in previously less controlled areas.
And Lu Mingchuan, he was the first governor, wasn't he?
Yes, first governor of the new Taiwan province. He spearheaded significant efforts to modernize the island,
Modernize how?
introducing innovations like electric street lighting in Taipei, pretty cutting edge for the time, constructing Taiwan's first railway line, and laying telegraph cables.
Sounds ambitious. Was it successful?
Well, these ambitious projects faced considerable financial and logistical challenges and achieved only limited success during his tenure. It was tough going.
And what about relations with the indigenous groups during this modernization push?
There were also renewed and often costly military campaigns launched against the indigenous populations in the mountainous regions, trying to bring them under firmer control.
So modernization alongside military campaigns?
A complex picture. By the end of Qing rule, Taiwan presented this kind of split reality. The western plains were largely developed and populated by a vast Han Chinese majority, while the mountainous interior remained largely autonomous, though under pressure. And the plains' Aboriginal communities had experienced significant cultural assimilation and loss of their ancestral lands.
The Qing rule in Taiwan was also marked by a number of significant internal conflicts and rebellions, primarily initiated by the Han Chinese settlers themselves. You mentioned Zhu Yigi earlier.
Yes, there were many. These rebellions were often fueled by grievances related to increased taxation, corruption within the local administration, and underlying social tensions between different groups of Han Chinese settlers. People from different parts of Fujian, for example, sometimes clashed.
So settler-on-settler conflict, too.
Oh, yeah. The Zhu Yugi Rebellion in 1720 and the much larger Lin Chuangwen Rebellion in 1786 were major examples of such widespread uprisings that significantly challenged Qing authority in Taiwan.
Big rebellions. Did the Aboriginal groups rebel often?
Interestingly, rebellions led by Plains Aborigines were relatively infrequent during Qing rule, perhaps because they were more assimilated or controlled, and the mountain Aboriginal groups largely maintained their autonomy until the very late Qing period, engaging more in localized resistance than large-scale revolt.
Okay. There were also various instances of foreign interest, incursions, and even attempted invasions of Taiwan during the Qing dynasty. You mentioned the Japanese, but others too. British, Americans, French.
Absolutely. The British certainly showed strategic interest in Taiwan during the First Opium War, even briefly considering seizing the island.
Really? The British almost took Taiwan.
They thought about it, and several shipwrecks involving Western vessels led to tragic incidents and diplomatic repercussions. The American Rover shipwreck in 1867 is a notable one.
What happened with the rover?
The crew was killed by indigenous peoples in the South after wrecking. This resulted in punitive expeditions by the U.S. military and subsequent negotiations directly with local tribes, bypassing the king to some extent.
Wow, direct U.S. negotiation with tribes in Taiwan.
Yeah, and the shipwreck of Ryukyuan fishermen on Taiwan in 1871, that's what led to the Mudan incident of 1874.
Okay, explain the Midan incident connection. Ryukyuan shipwreck, then Japan invades.
Right. The Ryukyuans were killed by indigenous people in the South. Japan demanded redress from the king. The king basically said, those people are beyond our effective control. So Japan used that as a pretext to send a military expedition in 1874, claiming to punish the tribes themselves and assert some kind of influence.
Using the king's lack of control as an excuse. Clever in a geopolitical way.
Exactly. It really highlighted king weakness and spurred their later efforts to control the whole island.
And the French.
During the Sino-French War in the 1880s, the French actually invaded and occupied Keelung in the north for a period. They bombarded coastal areas and imposed a blockade before eventually withdrawing.
So Taiwan was really caught up in these 19th century imperial conflicts.
Very much so. A strategic piece of land everyone was eyeing.
And the Qing dynasty's rule over Taiwan ultimately came to an end with the First Sino-Japanese War and the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895.
Correct. The treaty ceded Taiwan and the Pinghu Islands to Imperial Japan.
This must have been a momentous and deeply felt loss for China.
It was indeed a profound and humiliating loss for the Qing Empire. It became a significant and enduring rallying point for Chinese nationalism in the decades that followed. And for the people of Taiwan, of course, it marked the beginning of a half-century under Japanese colonial rule.
A completely new chapter.
A period that would fundamentally reshape the island and its identity.
The Japanese Empire's rule over Taiwan, as the article outlines, lasted 50 years, 1895 to 1945. And it can be broadly divided into three distinct phases.
That's a common way to look at it, yeah. First, an initial period of military suppression from about 1895 to 1915. Then a phase of assimilation called dukkha, from 1915 to 37. And finally, a period of intensified Japanization, kuminka, during World War II from 1937 to 45.
And they had different policies for the Han Chinese majority versus the indigenous population?
Yes, they implemented a separate and distinct set of policies specifically for the Aboriginal population, often much harsher.
Let's start with that first phase, military suppression. Was there a lot of resistance to the Japanese takeover?
Oh, absolutely. The initial years of Japanese rule immediately following the 1895 invasion were characterized by significant and often fierce armed resistance from the Taiwanese population, both Han and indigenous.
How long did that last?
This resistance lasted for several years and resulted in considerable casualties on both sides. There were tragic events like the Yunlin Massacre, where Japanese troops killed many civilians.
Yunlin Massacre.
And even after the initial large-scale resistance was suppressed, smaller uprisings and acts of rebellion continued to occur for years. Things like Bipipu Uprising, the Luofuxing Incident, the Tapani Incident, all were met with brutal suppression by the Japanese colonial authorities.
So a violent start to Japanese rule, but alongside the armed resistance, there also emerged non-violent forms of resistance and movements for greater autonomy, didn't there?
Yes, exactly. As armed resistance proved increasingly difficult and costly to sustain, various non-violent movements began to gain traction. Groups like the Taiwanese Cultural Association, the TCA.
What do they advocate for?
They advocated for greater self-determination, improved social and political rights for Taiwanese. They also brought attention to issues like the widespread opium trafficking that the Japanese initially tolerated.
Opium, the Japanese allowed that.
They managed it as a government monopoly for revenue, yeah. And these groups also highlighted the often harsh treatment of the indigenous peoples under colonial rule. Later came the Taiwanese People's Party, continuing this push for rights.
Okay. Then comes the assimilation movement, dukkha. Starting around 1915, what was the goal there? To make Taiwanese Japanese?
Essentially, yes. To integrate the Taiwanese into Japanese society, culture, and economy. But how successful was this policy in practice?
That's the question.
Well, the dukkha movement had, frankly, limited success in truly bridging the gap between the colonizers and the colonized. Initially, there was strict social and educational segregation between Japanese and Taiwanese populations, which persisted until 1922.
Segregation. So much for assimilation.
Right. And while the education system was eventually formally unified, the curriculum and the heavy emphasis on Japanese language proficiency often disadvantaged Taiwanese students. Access to higher education remained limited for them. True social and political equality remained largely elusive during this phase.
So more assimilation on paper than in reality.
You could argue that. Yeah. Then came the Kuminka movement during the Second World War, Japanization and intensified effort.
Why the intensification then? Because of the war.
Exactly. To foster loyalty to the Japanese Empire as the war effort escalated. The Kuminka movement represented a much more forceful push to transform the Taiwanese into loyal Japanese subjects.
How did they try to achieve that?
This involved actively promoting the Japanese language, Japanese culture, Shinto religious practices, while simultaneously discouraging and suppressing traditional Chinese customs and cultural expressions, banning certain holidays, things like that.
And the name changes.
Yes, one of the more controversial aspects was the encouragement, and in some cases pressure, for Taiwanese to adopt Japanese-style names.
How successful was Kaminka?
Again, due to the relatively short time frame and the deeply rooted cultural identity of the Taiwanese people, the Kuminka movement achieved only limited overall success in fully eradicating Taiwanese cultural identity and achieving its goals of complete Japanization. Some adopted Japanese names for practical reasons, but cultural identity remained strong.
What were the Japanese colonial government's policies specifically regarding the Aboriginal population of Taiwan? You said they were distinct and harsher.
Yes. The Japanese colonial administration largely continued the King classification system, that Shufan-Shengfen distinction, though they used different terms. But a key aspect of their policy was the outright denial of Aboriginal land rights.
Denied land rights. How?
All unclaimed or forested land, which was much of the traditional indigenous territory, was declared to be the property of the Japanese government.
Just take.
Pretty much. This led to significant forced relocations of indigenous communities out of the mountains and into supervised lowland villages, and naturally, considerable resistance.
And the Musha Uprising.
The Musha Uprising in 1930 stands as the most significant and tragic example of this resistance. Seediq tribesmen fiercely rebelled against Japanese oppression, attacking a Japanese gathering.
And the Japanese response.
Brutal suppression followed, including the use of aircraft and possibly chemical weapons, according to some accounts. It's a horrific event that really highlighted the violence of the colonial relationship.
Despite the ongoing resistance and the often harsh policies, the Japanese also undertook significant efforts in colonizing and industrializing Taiwan. Why?
Primarily with the aim of serving the economic and strategic needs of Imperial Japan, Taiwan was seen as a valuable resource base and agricultural producer.
Did many Japanese move to Taiwan?
Initially, Japanese migration to Taiwan was relatively limited. However, it gradually increased over time, with Japanese colonists disproportionately acquiring ownership of the most fertile and productive agricultural land. There were also instances of forced sale of land by Taiwanese owners to Japanese settlers.
And industrialization.
The Japanese colonial government heavily invested in developing Taiwan's infrastructure and industries. This included the construction of extensive railway networks, modern port facilities, large-scale irrigation systems to boost agricultural output, particularly sugar and rice.
Sugar and rice for Japan.
Exactly. And power generation plants. While this development did lead to significant economic growth in Taiwan during this period, it was fundamentally geared towards benefiting the colonial power. Taiwan became a crucial source of food and raw materials for Japan.
But that infrastructure must have been useful later.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that this infrastructure later formed a foundation for Taiwan's post-war economic development, although it also suffered significant damage from Allied bombing during World War II.
Right, World War II. Taiwan also played a significant role during the war as a key military base and industrial center for Japan.
Yes, given its strategic location, Taiwan became a vital military hub for Japan's expansionist ambitions in Southeast Asia. Its industries supported the war effort.
And many Taiwanese were even conscripted into the Japanese military, weren't they?
They were. Many Taiwanese were conscripted into the Japanese armed forces. While they served in various capacities, they often faced discrimination and lower pay compared to their Japanese counterparts.
What about the Takasago volunteers?
Those were indigenous Taiwanese, recruited specifically for their knowledge of jungle warfare, serving in Southeast Asia. They gained a certain notoriety for their fighting skills. However, like other Taiwanese veterans, they were often neglected and abandoned by the Japanese government after the war, denied pensions and recognition.
A difficult legacy. And the article also mentions the comfort women system.
Yes, it's crucial to acknowledge the horrific system of comfort women,
Yeah.
which existed in Taiwan as it did elsewhere in the Japanese Empire. This impacted both Han Taiwanese and indigenous women, many of whom were minors and were forcibly coerced or tricked into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. A terrible crime.
Truly awful. The end of Japanese rule in Taiwan came with Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945. The Cairo Declaration had mentioned the Allied intention for Taiwan to be returned to the Republic of China,
Right, the ROC.
but the actual legal status of Taiwan after the war remains a complex and debated issue to this day, doesn't it?
Very much so. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the administration of Taiwan was handed over to the Republic of China. This event is commemorated in Taiwan as Taiwan Retrocession Day.
Retrocession Day.
However, the formal legal transfer of sovereignty remains a subject of ongoing debate among international law scholars. While Japan renounced its claims to Taiwan in the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951,
They gave up their claim.
they did, but that treaty did not explicitly name the recipient of that sovereignty. The ROC subsequently signed the Treaty of Taipei with Japan in 1952, but the interpretation of these treaties regarding Taiwan's ultimate legal status continues to be a key point of contention.
So it's legally ambiguous.
It falls under the umbrella of what is known as the theory of the undetermined status of Taiwan. It's a core issue in cross-strait relations and Taiwan's international standing.
Okay. This brings us to the Republic of China era in Taiwan from 1945 to the present day. The initial ROC administration under the Kuomintang KMT faced significant local discontent. Why was that? Weren't people happy to be rid of the Japanese?
There was initial optimism, yes, but the initial ROC administration, led by Chen Yi, was often perceived by the local Taiwanese population, the Benshengren, as corrupt, inefficient, and discriminatory, especially when compared to the relatively more organized, albeit oppressive, Japanese rule.
Worse than the Japanese in some ways.
In terms of corruption and economic mismanagement, many felt so. This quickly led to widespread disillusionment and unrest, and this tragically culminated in the February 28th incident in 1947.
The 228 incident, a very sensitive topic.
Extremely. It started with a dispute over contraband cigarettes, but rapidly escalated into a brutal crackdown by the KMT government on civilian protests across the island. It resulted in thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of deaths.
Tens of thousands.
Estimates vary widely, but it was a massacre. And it marked the beginning of a long period of political repression known as the White Terror.
The White Terror, how long did that last?
Effectively from 1949, when martial law was declared, until it was lifted in 1987. Decades. It silenced dissent, led to countless arrests, imprisonments, and executions. It had a profound and lasting traumatic impact on Taiwanese society.
And all this was happening as the Chinese Civil War was reaching its climax on the mainland.
Exactly. Then in 1949, following their defeat in the Chinese Civil War against Mao Zedong's Communist Party, the ROC government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan.
Bringing soldiers and civilians?
Yes, bringing with them approximately 2 million refugees, soldiers, officials, civilians, or Weishengren. They established Taipei as their provisional capital.
Provisional capital.
Yeah.
Still aiming to retake the mainland.
That was the official line for decades. The KMT leadership viewed this move to Taiwan as a temporary strategic retreat, with the ultimate goal of eventually recovering mainland China. However, their rule on Taiwan would ultimately last for several decades and fundamentally shape the island's political trajectory.
What was their focus initially? Just military control?
Initially, yes. Their focus was heavily on military buildup, consolidating control, and suppressing any perceived communist or independence threats under martial law. But later, especially after the U.S. resumed aid during the Korean War, they shifted their emphasis towards economic development.
And this period witnessed the remarkable Taiwan miracle, right? A period of rapid industrialization and impressive economic growth.
That's right. The KMT government, having taken over the former Japanese monopolies and benefiting from substantial economic aid from the United States, implemented a series of strategic economic policies. Land reform was a key early step,
Land reform.
breaking up large land holdings and redistributing land to tenant farmers. It boosted agriculture and created a more stable social base. Then they focused on developing light industry and promoting exports.
Export-oriented growth.
Exactly. Fostered a strong export-oriented economy. Key infrastructure projects, known as the 10 major construction projects in the 1970s, were also crucial in laying the groundwork for this rapid economic transformation. Taiwan became one of the Asian tigers.
But politically, it was still authoritarian.
Very much so, under one-party KMT rule and martial law. But eventually, things started to change, beginning under the leadership of Chiang Ching-kuo, Chiang Kai-shek's son.
Chiang Ching-kuo?
Taiwan underwent a gradual process of democratic reforms.
Why did he initiate reforms? Pressure.
A combination of factors. Growing internal pressure from a rising middle class and nascent opposition movements, the Dangwai or outside the party movement. Also, shifting international dynamics like the U.S. switching recognition to the PRC. Chiang Ching-kuo, perhaps recognizing the changing domestic and international landscape, initiated a series of political reforms that gradually loosened the KMT's tight grip on power.
What were the key reforms?
The lifting of martial law in 1987 was the pivotal moment that was huge. It allowed for the legalization of opposition political parties, most notably the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP.
The DPP, the main opposition party today.
Exactly. And this paved the way for further democratization, culminating in the landmark first direct presidential election in 1996.
Won by Lee Tang-hui of the KMT, right. But it was a direct election.
Yes, a major milestone.
The subsequent democratic period has seen a significant shift in Taiwan's political landscape. The KMT's long dominance ended.
Ended in 2000 with the election of the DPP's Chen Shui-bian as president. That was the first transfer of power to an opposition party, a huge moment for Taiwan's democracy.
And since then,
we've seen a series of subsequent elections, power alternating between the KMT, Ma Ying-jeou served 2 terms, and the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen served 2 terms. There have also been significant political and social developments.
like the sunflower movement.
Yes, the large-scale sunflower student movement in 2014, protesting a trade deal with China, showed the vibrancy and power of civil society. And of course, the historic legalization of same-sex marriage in 2019, a first in Asia.
Socially quite progressive then.
In many ways, yes. Taiwan's democratic system has continued to mature and evolve, with power alternating between different political parties through free and fair elections.
And economically, still strong.
Economically, Taiwan has solidified its position as a global leader in the high-tech sector, particularly in the absolutely crucial semiconductor industry. Companies like TSMC play a dominant role on the world stage. It's vital to global supply chains.
TSMC, yeah, everyone knows them now. More recently, international events have cast a shadow, haven't they? Things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine
That definitely had an impact.
and increasingly heightened tensions in cross-strait relations with China, particularly following high-profile visits like Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan in 2022.
Absolutely. These events have undoubtedly raised public awareness in Taiwan regarding potential security threats from the PRC. They've led to increased government spending on military defense, extending conscription, and a greater emphasis on civil defense preparedness.
And China's reaction to Pelosi's visit.
China launched large-scale military exercises encircling Taiwan in response to Pelosi's visit. It served as a stark reminder of the ongoing complexities, the military threat, and the extreme sensitivities in the Taiwan Strait.
And in the most recent 2024 presidential election,
William Lai Ching-te of the DPP emerged victorious, securing a historic 3rd consecutive term for the party. However, no single political party secured a majority in the legislative yuan, Taiwan's parliament.
a divided government.
Exactly. This outcome reflects the continued dynamism and complexity of Taiwan's contemporary political landscape, presenting both opportunities and, well, challenges for the future.
Well, that was a truly deep dive. I mean, from the mists of prehistory, the Austronesian origins, right through to the intricate realities of the 21st century, the history of Taiwan is nothing short of extraordinary.
It really is. It's a story marked by these successive waves of influence in it. From the earliest indigenous inhabitants to the Dutch and Spanish colonizers, the Kingdom of Tunning, the vast Qing dynasty, the Japanese Empire, and finally, the Republic of China era. So many layers.
So many layers. What is consistently striking, though, reading through this history, is the remarkable resilience and adaptability of the people of Taiwan.
Absolutely. They have navigated periods of colonization, intense conflict, significant political upheaval, multiple changes in rulers and systems, yet ultimately forging a unique and distinct identity in the process.
Yeah, a real sense of Taiwanese identity has emerged, particularly in recent decades.
Definitely.
So as you reflect on this journey through Taiwan's long and layered past, thinking about everything we've covered, what single event or period do you think has most profoundly shaped its identity as it exists today?
Oh, that's a tough question. There are so many contenders.
Mm.
Maybe the Japanese era for infrastructure and a sense of separation, maybe the KMT era and the white terror shaping political identity, or maybe the democratic transition itself. It's hard to pick just one.
It really is. And how does gaining a deeper understanding of this history, all these layers we've talked about, inform the ongoing discussions and debates about Taiwan's future in the 21st century, its relationship with China, its place in the world?
Well, knowing this history shows that Taiwan's story isn't simple. It wasn't always just part of China. It has its own complex narrative, its own experiences. Understanding that context is crucial for understanding the present-day political situation and the aspirations of its people.
It definitely adds crucial perspective. It's certainly something worth contemplating further.